Good afternoon. We're in the middle of another unfathomable Friday in an unfathomable time. And it's our honor to be able to be here at the end of a Friday and getting real. We are in the midst of multiple pandemics of COVID, systemic racism, white supremacy, and policing, the dismantling of democracy that have provided a societal and political x-ray and racial x-ray of the bones of our community and our democracy, where they're broken and where the connective tissue has worn away. This is a time of reckoning and of history where the ground we are all standing on is shifting, and for too many, it is crumbling. And it is a time of unearthing our humanity and our anger, grief, and loss. And what is being unearthed seems to defy the language, the rhythms, and the narratives we've all settled into. Each of the filmmakers here have brought us to stories of our time, of abolitionist millennial leaders' fight for dignity and liberation, especially around policing in Chicago, of the fight for healthcare access for undocumented people, and of women running for office to right and repair our democracy and reestablish what it means to serve. They raise questions of whether our stories of politics and power have also been stories of liberation and of community, and whether they can be stories of transformation if they are not. And they have left us with the richness of what is inspired in the telling of movements that have turned into political action and of power. So with that, let me introduce you to this extraordinary and wondrous set of filmmakers who have joined us today. So we're going to turn to each of them to be able to introduce themselves, and I'm going to start with Ashley, and then we can continue.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, IDA, so much for having me here and for gathering us in this virtual space. My name is Ashley O'Shea. I am a DP and documentarian based in Chicago, and I recently just debuted my feature doc, Unapologetic, which is a deep look into the movement for Black lives in Chicago through the experiences of Janae and Bella, two young Black queer women.
Thank you, Ashley. Grace, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Grace Lee. I'm a documentary filmmaker based here in Los Angeles, also an organizer through ADOC, the Asian American Documentary Network, along with Marjan Safinia, who you'll meet. We're the co-directors and co-producers of And She Could Be Next, which looks at a transformative movement of women of color in American politics.
Marjan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Marge. Thank you for coming. That was a heavy intro, Annie Rima. I hope we can live up to that weight. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I'm the former board chair of IDA and an incredibly proud Getting Real fanatic. Just excited to get into this conversation. Like Grace said, we made a 2-part documentary series, became POV's first ever broadcast series, and specifically centering race and gender when telling a grand American political story.
Great, and Seth?
Hi, everyone. Seth Hernandez Ronquillo. They, them also use other gender pronouns, originally coming from Tongva Tataviam Chumash lands, also known as the San Fernando Valley. I am a male presenting person with olive skin, with black hair and black beard and wear eyeglasses. And I'm wearing a red shirt that says Decolonize. And I am the filmmaker behind Coverage about healthcare access for undocumented adults. Thank you.
It sounds like we're going back around just to do image descriptions. Yeah, okay. I am a feminine presenting person with, I'm gonna say olive skin too, and a black hat that says HQIC and eyes that look exhausted.
This is Grace. Also, I'm a East Asian woman with glasses and kind of, I don't know, is this shoulder length? Yes, shoulder length hair and a black t-shirt. I'm in a room that has white walls and a bookshelf in the background.
Hi, it's Marge. We should have totally done this the first time around. I'm in LA on Chumash land. I'm an Iranian woman with olive skin, lots of curly brown hair. I'm wearing a green top with polka dots, orange earrings, and I'm in a light and calming blue room known as my eternal cell, where I haven't left for months.
And I'm Anurima, and I am an Indian woman with also with olive skin. We'll just go with that. And I have longer than shoulder length hair, and am wearing earrings that are chain link, but they are shortened to fit onto my ears, and a red and black flowery shirt. And I am sitting on the south side of Chicago, overlooking way up high, so I can overlook some buildings that are near the water. And this is where I'm grounded. Thank you. All right. So, as a first question, I wanted to ask all of you about the ways in which your work in your documentary work. Who did you seek to empower, and who are you empowering? Any one of you can start. I'll maybe start with Seth at this, and then we can go the other way than we started.
Sounds wonderful. In the work that I do, I guess as an undocumented person myself, there's so much media about the community where I come from. Immigration is always like a hot topic issue. You know, every year there's a series about undocumented folks. There's all these researchers, sociologists that want to like research our experiences. But I feel like often the main audience for which the story of my community is told is not my own community. If anything, often the stories of undocumented people are catered to the gaze of citizens. You know, it's always like, it feels like this desire that, you know, we are telling your story as an undocumented person that cannot vote, you know, so that other people can vote on your behalf, right? And I think there's an assumption that my community does not have political power because we are unable to vote. When we recognize, you know, that policy victories, you know, big or small, like the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals was won by the organizing of undocumented people, right? So for me, when I create work about my community, the primary people that I'm speaking to for the most part is other undocumented people. And actually, even more specifically, myself. And my folks have seen Nadia Shihab's documentary Jadowland. In that film, you know, she's following her mom, and her mom says something along the lines, you know, who's an artist? Her mom is an artist, and she says, I don't make art to make beautiful things. I make art to make meaning of my life, you know? And I think for me, as a person who tells stories, I make things to make sense of my experience and my community's experience. And in a very micro sense, it's the experience of an undocumented Filipino queer person.
Yeah, I feel very similar to Seth in that you know, I have been surrounded by Black people my entire life. And I guess specifically with Unapologetic, that came at a time where I had been in Chicago for a number of years, but I had been in the suburbs. And so I was just then coming to the city and really being introduced to the breadth and the depth of the Black community in Chicago. And it was just so different from what I was seeing in the media, what my, you know, out-of-state family and friends were seeing in the media about Chicago. You know, it's labeled as this murder capital of the world when it has very similar violence rates to a lot of other major cities throughout America. And that's just not what I was seeing in terms of just how hard Chicagoans go in terms of political organizing, and taking care of their community at every level. And so I just wanted to give life to, not give life to that. I just wanted to, I wanted to uplift that power that was already existing, that presented. All your screens just went blank, but I'm assuming you can still hear me. Was not being, okay, great. It was not being presented, you know, in the mainstream form. And so it's interesting because I feel like with Unapologetic, I'm always asked, like, why did you decide to focus on women for your story? And I'm just like, why wouldn't I? I don't know. It's just like, it's who I am. It's how I identify. It's my community. And like Seth said, there's so much that we are just, like, as filmmakers, it's a process of learning ourselves in a way too. And, you know, at the age I was at and where I was in my career, I just felt like I really needed to explore a project from that standpoint. And being in Chicago, where so much was happening in so many amazing ways, you know, I was really making it for the Chicago Black community. But I know that it can speak to so many other Black communities throughout the country and the world. So.
I'll go. I mean, I seek to empower us, right? The people who look like the people on this panel. And, you know, we just don't see ourselves in our full aspects, right? I'm from Iran. Every Iranian I've ever seen on a screen has been something very different than me, you know, and most of the people I know. And then that experience translates to all the other types of otherness, right? And so I think it's about, yeah, I mean, for me, my work is about empowering and reframing the thing that you think you might know, you know, from a more insider perspective. And I think it particularly with And She Could Be Next, we were seeking to empower this massive group of people in America that we think of as the new American majority, right? All of us who, you know, don't check the first box in the list, you know, remind ourselves of our collective power, which I think is, you know, at the heart of everything, including this conference. You know, we're here to talk about how do we build collective power. And so if storytelling carries some piece of that work, then that's the kind of storytelling I'm interested in.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. Everything that Ashley and Marge has said so far really resonates with me. But I also think it's an evolution. I mean, my first films were very personal. It was called the Grace Lee Project, you know, looking at stereotypes of Asian American women. But, you know, in the process, you know, of making films over many years, you know, we realized that there's a whole array of folks who, like me, whose stories aren't, who are woefully absent from the public eye and also from like the political discourse, especially, you know, when we're looking at elections, when we're looking at politics, all of that stuff. You know, we really wanted to tell a story about American politics that centered race and gender. And that's not something that I have seen that often. And so it was important for us to really stick a stake in the ground to tell the story that way.
Thank you all. You really did tell stories that felt like us. And, you know, Ashley, I think about Chicago Going Hard and how familiar it felt to watch the documentary and how much it was about going hard from home. Like, and the ways in which, you know, there's so much about the ways in which you told these stories that that not only represented us, but felt like us. And so I, you know, deeply grateful for all of your work. I mean, the next question, I'm gonna steal a line from Unapologetic in asking this, which is, I wanted to talk about like the gap that you were trying to illuminate in power and movements, you know, and you know, as we heard in Unapologetic, you know, what is the historical, the unlikely, rarely reported about leaders in communities like ours? What is that for each of you? And sort of what are those gaps that you were trying to make sure we could all see?
I'll jump in.
I love that.
You want to go after?
Oh,
You go last. Well, I mean, I was just going to say for us, it's you know you said a little bit, Anirima, we all like are holding our breath with what's unfolding, you know, politically in this very moment. But we put all of our focus politically, or most of our focus, you know, on the person in the White House, on the people on Capitol Hill, and even at the local level on our electeds. But what we don't understand is the real political power is people, right? And so for us, that was like the critical kind of, you know, not most often told story was there are no elected officials without movement. None. They just can't win elections without movement, right? So what is who is movement? Who is doing that work? And what is the nature of that work? Like, what does that actually look like? And sort of getting us off this, weaning us as a country off this very simplistic idea that our political power is rooted in just elections, which it isn't, right? And elections come and elections go, and there'll always be another one. But building power in community is the transformative element. And, you know, we refer affectionately to many of the organizers who we follow as our hidden figures. It's the same exact story. This is a group of, you know, women that we just don't know what their names are, but without them, you know, we'd have nothing. So that was who we were trying to sort of illuminate, as well as the candidates who are obviously the kind of icing on the cake.
Yeah, I love that you were able to pull that quote because it happened so quickly in the beginning of the film. I sometimes worry people don't hear it, but you know, I think what's interesting about this whole panel here is we all have women protagonists at the center of our films. And for me, that was the gap that I was definitely looking to illuminate. You know, historically, there's been a lot of sexism in Black movement. And although women have always been present in terms of leadership and boots on the ground work, they're not always the ones that are the most centered in the work. And so in Chicago at the time, a lot of organizations and collectives were moving towards this idea of a Black queer feminist lens, and the idea that if you center the folks furthest on the margins, then when they get free, everybody else, you know, by default gets free as well. And so for me, that was just so different than what I have been taught in my formal education. I've been in private school my whole life. I went to Northwestern, and nowhere on that path had somebody centered someone that looked like me in that way. And so I was looking to illuminate that, and it really was kind of also a selfish journey so that I had a reason to look into women like Ella Baker and Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, that were bedrocks of these movements, but were not are not talked about as presently as like an MLK or a Malcolm X. And yeah, I just, women and femmes are just power, and I just didn't understand why people weren't talking about it. So that's kind of how we ended up there.
I just add that, you know, for me, a lot of documentary filmmaking is, I think, as Ashley said, it's about pursuing certain questions. And for me, it's a lot of it has been unlearning and like, you know, correcting a vision of history or a vision of what the American experience is. Because in my own reality, like looking around, you know, my community, it's not what I see, right? And I think that like really fundamental understanding of, you know, what are we reporting back? What are we reflecting back in our stories? What are we reflecting back in this democracy that isn't reflective of us? Those are the questions that kind of, you know, course through like the filmmaking and the questions that I'm interested in making films.
Yeah, and I think for me, I echo everything that folks have said. I think through the lens of how undocumented stories are told, often who's highlighted are young activists. And in coverage, we're following an elderly woman who is a caregiver, taking care of other elderly people, who's a grandmother, a mother, you know, and who is an organizer herself, working with the Filipino Worker Center and other domestic worker organizations. And our other key protagonist is a trans masculine person Often who's highlighted in the immigrant youth movement, also young people who are cisgender, right? And being able to really shift on who is represented when we talk about these movements, kind of like what Ashley was talking about. I think also what we're intentional about is when we talk about stories of undocumented folks, often it's just like in English and Spanish, and in coverage, we also bring in Tagalog. Actually, our protagonist, Emma, is trilingual, so she speaks another Filipino language, but I didn't understand Cebuano, so I asked her to speak in Tagalog, which is what I understood, So how do we make sure to really embrace the different layers of our community and represent it as richly as possible through the stories we tell?
It's that one of the things that was really moving to me was the way in which even your two protagonists were linked, in the sense that one was actually thinking about from undocu elder, right? So there's a way in which it crosses generations in the work, and in the way in which who you're presenting and how they are all part of a community that is trying to fight for change, that will go from for young people to elders as well, right? So and to that, I wanted to and let me just throw in, just because Ashley, you mentioned it, another quote from Unapologetic that resonated with me was from Janae about women's leadership has been so much more visible than it has ever been, and it's something I think we can come back to in a moment. I did want to ask you all about in the context of particularly what Seth just said, like who's become part of the communities in the telling of these stories, right? So who is missing, and then also who is missing from these communities and the telling, and why? So how did you think about not just power and empowering, but also like what gets built and who becomes part of communities as you're telling these stories? And there was something that you thought about and reflected on as you were making this work.
I think, I think another reason why I started this process was because I did not really have an entry point into the movement, or I guess I wasn't courageous enough at the time to find an entry point into the movement. And I found these two really compelling women, one pursuing her PhD and the other raptivist from the west side of Chicago, that had two very different stories, but were both like united through their movement work. And part of that thinking is that like I wanted to make a piece that would encourage anybody that watches it that there's always an entry point into the movement. You just have to figure out kind of what it is for you. And then you can even throw me in there, like I saw my entry point as being a filmmaker, like that was the skill and the talent that I had at the time. And so I felt that was something that I could contribute in a way that was authentic, and could still be useful to the larger cause. I do still think in a lot of movement spaces, there's not as much room made for people that are like most affected by the issues, which is why I really admire the work that Bella does, because she really centers Austin and Chicago, the West Side, like in her work, which is one of the poorest communities in the city, one of the most under-resourced communities in the city. And so often in movement work, folks are surrounded by other academic types or people that have been kind of steeped in the work for years. But we're really talking about issues a lot of times that don't even affect us. I'm a Black woman, but I'm not the same type of Black woman as Janae and Bella. And so I really, I hope that we keep moving towards that, because the people closest to the issue are the closest to the solution, and we can't just center identities that kind of walk the straight and narrow already when we talk about movement space.
Just to pick up on that, I think who's missing from community in our film are white men. I don't think we did a really good job of representing, white male politicians, and where they do show up, they show up in the form of Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, and I have to say, it gave us a bit of a thrill to do that. I mean, it just gave us a bit of a thrill to just see, can we what is the rigor that we also have to apply to just stay in the lane of women of color, right? We have a little opening at the beginning of the first episode where sort of in 3 minutes we, do a sort of blood pumping fast montage to bring you through the history of women of color kind of movement, right? Like on whose shoulders do these women stand? And as we were like brainstorming in the edit suite with Julie Dietz, our editor, and we were trying to think of like, well, what are these like key political moments when we look at the last 100 years? We had to push ourselves to actually think about those moments, not in the body of a white man, right? And so that was also an interesting process to sort of, who can we not leave out with intention, right? I mean, there's lots of white men who watch our film and find a lot of power in it too. But truly, when we're talking about power and especially political power, when you close your eyes, what you see is a man in a suit, most often, right? A white man in a suit. And so it was an interesting way to see how can we tell that same story without relying on that crutch at all.
I think it's safe to say that Brian Kemp is not part of any community that we want to be a part of. And there's an interesting question I have about that, though, right? Which is the ways in which a Brian Kemp becomes a catalyst for community, right? Which is, and essentially in opposition to someone who is trying to dismantle the very community that has been built, right? And did get built. I want to, I mean, for Grace and Seth, let me just add my other part of this question, because I'm not sure how clear it was. Is I'm also wondering like how in the telling of the stories that you made, the communities were created or built as you told those stories. And so wanted to ask that question too. And I realized I didn't maybe say that as clearly as I should have in the beginning.
Would you like to go first?
Sure. I mean, for us, we took on a really big, ambitious project that had a clear time limit, shooting over 2018 election cycle. And we couldn't have done it, just the two of us. We galvanized, gathered a group of really accomplished other directors, documentary directors, also women of color who, kind of culturally closely matched the communities that we were filming. And that was really important to us. I mean, in many ways, the community already exists because they're our friends and colleagues. But it felt at that moment to be working together on this project was empowering, not just for us. I mean, the whole project was empowering to work on in this era, but to work on it on something that was intentionally focusing on representation at every level, not just in the subject matter, but in our crew. That was really important to us and actually made a huge difference. I've always wanted to do that, but that's never been the case. Although that's not true. I worked on the Asian American series this year and we had a similar experience. But that's the way that I want to work. And it's always, how I was trained. I was mentored by people who did that. And, I feel like that's how we build community and that's how we continue to build, our power as filmmakers in this space, telling these kinds of stories.
It took me a second to wrap my head around the question, and hearing Ashley, Margis, and Grace's response really helped. So apologies. But I'm almost a little hesitant to share my response just because I feel like my experience in the way I do the process of my documentary filmmaking might be frowned upon by a lot of the mainstream methodologies around filmmaking. Because for me, I love the question and how community was built in the creation. With me, when we were creating coverage, and I don't want to say it's my film because in many ways it's my protagonist film also, and it's the film that we really want to be able to use for this movement work around healthcare access for undocumented folks. I make the film in a very collaborative way, when every time I have a rough cut, I'm sharing with the two protagonists to let them know, are you comfortable with how you're being represented? Actually, there was originally a third protagonist that was part of coverage, who was also an undocumented leader, but, they were navigating their paperwork, and navigating their casework and adjusting their status. And when I shared the film with them, they were like, yes, let's move forward, But then they shared it with their lawyer, and their lawyer said, you might want to think twice about this because it might harm your case. So in the 11th hour, a week before, we were going to have this community premiere, we edited the film one last time and removed them, And I think, especially when working with undocumented folks, how can we make sure that folks who have very volatile situations in their lives have agency in how the stories are told? And even beyond that, when we were doing coverage, in the editing process, I would share cuts with folks who are leading the Health for All movement to get a sense, whether what we're saying is helpful for the movement. Of course, I think sometimes advocates, to me, my experience having been an organizer for a while, advocates might not see the artistic value and the artistic expression and might disregard that. So of course there's like a pushback also that I do. But for me, it's important to build that community through a collaborative process where folks are able to engage in the film that you're creating, especially if it's about a particular issue that impacts so many folks, when there's organizers on the ground that have been doing work on this for so long, and how can we engage with them in a generative conversation?
Can I follow up on that? Which is, I mean, in each of your cases, there were movements, the Movement for Black Lives, the Health for All. Like there's movements that have been there as you described. I mean, in the case of, and She Could Be Next, I think there were so many movements that were going on in the different communities that you were in. So how did you think about your engagement with those movements and those organizations, and in what ways were there moments where you felt like did you feel the need to sort of represent in some ways what those movements were about, and how did that play out for each of you?
Yeah, that that happened a lot with Unapologetic, and honestly was one of the more difficult parts of the process, because when we were in production, there was just so much that I was learning about movement work and like strategy and how people work together, that it was like in a lot of ways influencing the film that I thought I was going to make. And at the time, there were so many collectives and organizations starting in Chicago that I felt the pressure to try to represent every single one in its true form. And, ultimately, I think I realized like, I can't do that. That's impossible to represent that many organizations as a whole. And also that, I had to realize that a lot of them are less than 5 years old, like still learning how they want to operate and exist in the world and trying to do right by their community. And so it almost felt like kind of too early to even like document them in that way, because I knew that they were just going through so much process. And I think that's ultimately why we kind of pivoted more towards like the character-driven story about Janae and Bella, because I just didn't want to misrepresent anybody. And, there's still notions of it in the film, and there's nods, there's a whole section that just talks about kind of how all the different organizations were built up in Chicago. So I still kind of left it there, but I almost wanted Unapologetic to just be a piece of it that folks and organizers could use in their own ways to whatever they're speaking to, because there's there's an artist movement space in Chicago. There's one specific towards young Black women. There's just so many. And so it was just hard to try to represent all of that in a way that felt ethical and true to what they were doing.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on what Ashley was saying. I think for me, having been an organizer before I dived into filmmaking, also with a background in impact producing, I guess what I've realized also is sometimes we might romanticize the collaborativeness and even the work of organizers. To be honest, as a person who's organized for a long time, movement spaces are also very messy, like there's drama,
Yes.
and like folks can be territorial, like you tell that story on behalf of that organization, we're not going to work with you because we have like beef with them, so there is that kind of like tension also that sometimes happen, and I think and as a cultural worker and storyteller, for me also, what I've experienced is that sometimes movement folks, especially as a person, like I'm not like the level of like these three amazing other filmmakers in front of me, like I'm like an emerging filmmaker. My documentary is a short documentary, like I sometimes, it feels like if you don't have the street creds, folks are like, why would we work with you? You're not going to bring clout to our work, So and to what Ashley was saying also earlier about directly impacted folks sometimes being pushed aside by like the more like fancy degree people, it happens so often also in immigrant rights justice spaces, and I think for me, my experience is that folks sometimes would be like, oh, you're just an artist, like what can you do for us, like I'm the one out here representing people in the court, and how do we shift, the way that cultural organizing is also understood in movement spaces. I think it's part of the conversation, while we're also navigating the dynamic in the documentary field, where particular communities are also excluded, So sometimes I feel like I'm sandwiched between two turfs that hate me, and I guess what are ways to really navigate that, while we also have, while we stick to our integrity and independence as artists.
Grace?
Standing upright in the middle of a hot mess. So in many ways, go ahead. Sorry.
Grace, do you have anything?
I mean, I just, everything Seth said, like I learned so much from Seth. Like he has brought so much, anyway, you're not hated. Like, I mean, we need you. I just wanted to say that because everything that you are doing is so important. Not just to the field, but in the work that you do. I think I'm trying to remember what the question was. Anyway, I just kind of got stuck on that. Yeah, exactly. It was somehow related to the topic, but now I'm totally, I'm losing it.
Let me jump in for a minute.
Yeah.
Go on.
Oh, I did think of something in terms of. You know what, Marge, you go. I'll join in.
Well, I was just going to bounce off what Seth was saying about movement space being, messy and territorial, and a whole other layer in the layer cake of political power and political stuff, and I think that one of the things that we had to struggle with was building like trust, from movement. And once in our film, I would say perhaps the strongest relationship on the organizers that we built was with Nsé Ufot, who runs the New Georgia Project. And because Nsé is so well respected, like that helped, buy us a little bit of credibility. But I remember being in a really intense, like windowless bunker in those 3 days right after the Georgia election, where everything was complete chaos. And we were in that 3-day window where, all kinds of organizers were crammed together in this like one windowless room, frantically trying to call people to let them know they had 3 days to cure their provisional ballots. And it was a very intense kind of true boiler room situation. And then we were in there as well, right, with a camera, and and it was just really sort of fraught. I think that there is unfortunately a high level of distrust of folks like us, right, and that's partly because of media, and also partly because, well, I mean, it's tough. I understand the reservations of people because one soundbite can ricochet around the world and, cancel culture things right out of existence. But at the same time, I feel like it's really important that movement has storytellers, right? And in the case of our film, it wasn't like we weren't making this film in our own backyard. We hadn't been embedded in that movement work, right? But we were telling a much larger story about a movement for reflective democracy. And anyway, so that was an interesting push-pull, like being in the hottest moments of, you know, deep movement work with all the whirling of trying to figure out what do we do in this like moment, and then to be also there as an external force, and having to be comfortable a little bit with the tension of, I knew that we needed this, like I knew that once this passed and they had some sleep, they would be grateful that we had this on camera, right? But they didn't know that when I was in this tiny room in their faces. And I think there are some times where you have to ride that tension, you know, and this is true in all kinds of documentary filmmaking, because you know the longevity of the footprint it leaves as a sort of a historical document, you know, is more important and outweighs in some ways the discomfort of the moment in which when you're in their faces and they're just trying to figure their shit out and they don't want a camera in their faces, you know. So anyway, for whatever it's worth, that's you know, that's, I think that there's a lot to navigate between storytelling and movement.
If I can just hop in really quick, that last point you made, Marge, just about the importance of archiving and capturing historical movements. That was a lot of what kept pushing me through with my process, because movements are cyclical. Like the sexism we're seeing in the movement for Black lives today was happening in the 60s and 70s. And in so many ways, I felt like if we don't document it and talk about it, it's just going to happen again in 20 years. And so, yeah, there were moments where I you know, had that ethical conundrum where I was like, okay, maybe this isn't comfortable in the moment, but we just have to let it steep a bit and sit itself out and see where we end up. And what I found so interesting as the film is rolled out, the community, for the most part, as far as I know, is just so grateful to have the document, because especially this summer, as we've kind of met another uprising around Black lives, you know, it's something that they can look to remember what they were able to accomplish and how far they were able to progress as short as 5 years ago, you know? So I really resonate with that.
Yeah, I do too. We are there because we're documenting history also. And, you know, having worked on historical films as well, like, for example, in The Asian Americans, we tell the story of the ethnic studies strike at San Francisco State in 1968. And, you know, talking to Asian Americans, we're looking for archival footage through all of the news footage. You don't see any because the people who held the cameras were only showing like white people, you know. I mean, it is really important for us to be able to be there to like document what's going on the ground, even if this may not be used until, you know, 40, 50 years later in some series that, you know, we'll be looking back at how we got here. I think that's really critical. And that's also, you know, something that sort of keeps you there when you feel like, oh, they're not really happy with me here, but, you know, it's worth it, right? Like, and I think that some people get it, you know, and they understand like the historic nature of what they're doing, and you try to find those people and keep talking to them.
So we have lots of questions from the audience, and I'm very excited to turn to those. Let me start with a question about, and some of these are going to overlap, and I'll try to keep them streamlined. How the first question: how can we create a virtuous cycle between making documentary films and movement building? Can the films help strengthen political movements, and can political movements expand the reach of our films?
Yes. Yes, but not with that. There are often tensions continuing, you know, even after the thing is done, for some of the reasons I think that we just covered, right? Which is, I mean, again, just staying in the frame of our project, our film covers the work of a lot of folks, you know, in various movements, but our film is not exclusively about any one of them, right? And so, you know, as a tool for that movement to then use afterwards, you know, everyone wants to highlight themselves and their bit, right? And so there's a there's a messaging conflict sometimes that exists between kind of creative, a story told about a thing, and then the actual kind of action agendas of that movement itself. And sometimes those things align, in which case it's a beautiful virtuous cycle. And sometimes they're not quite aligned enough. But I think that one of the things that we held, I see there's also something about impact goals, so I'm going to just bleed over that line for a minute. I think that one of the things that we held as an impact goal was that we were interested in uplifting the voices and the narratives of these women of color organizers, right? And so even if they can't use it in the sense of like pushing the agenda of the New Georgia Project or pushing the agenda of Mi Gente forward, what we can do is continue to use this sort of mass broadcast tool to continually elevate their voices. And what we've been seeing in the wake of that is, you know, news channels who want commentary on something are now going to MC Ufot, are now going to, you know, Tanya Anzueta, they're going to Natasha Brown, they're going to some of the women who are in our film, and now they can just use their voices in these much larger arenas and people know about them and their work. So yes, in that way, but it's not always like a clean, I scratch your back, you scratch my back, and we both do better kind of paradigm.
Marge, while you're there, can I ask you to also just talk a little bit about, you know, the kind of political nature of making a political documentary, and so, I mean, which is in part linked to what you were just talking about, and also expands from there.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to talk about that for a minute in our group, because I think, you know, we're here in a documentary conference, right? And I think that we have to address the fact that making a political film, now looking at it not from the political frame, but looking like within the documentary frame, you know, is people are squeamish about politics, period. Funders are squeamish about politics. Networks are squeamish about politics. I mean, And She Could Be Next ran on PBS with some cover because we were on POV, as you know, it was sort of presented by POV. But even not public media, like there's just, people are really squeamish about this idea of politics, that somehow we always have to sort of stay in this kind of very bipartisan frame, or this is too directly political. And, you know, that makes it really hard and frustrating to make work about politics. And, you know, I live in the camp of everything is politics right now. Like, I don't know what isn't political right now. I don't know what aspect of any of our existences isn't deeply political. So if we are here to examine the human experience through our work, how can we do that without being political? And you know, I hope that our funder communities, our impact funder communities can all sort of find some courage to understand that this work is critical and vital to the documentation of this historical moment that we find ourselves in, especially in this country, but this is true of everywhere. You know, and to sort of have the courage to understand the value of us having this body of work from this time. So that's one piece of it. And then the other piece of it is, you know, for us, and I would venture for Ashley and Set as well, the kinds of filmmakers we were. I think they're very comfortable when, you know, if you have a sort of well-established white male filmmaker who wants to make a political doc about a well-established white male politician, you know, maybe I'm wrong, please, you know, at me if I am, but I think that generally those things are smooth, there's a smoother fit, right? But like Grace and I constantly felt like we were in our own political campaign, you know, life mirroring art, because we were constantly, like the women in our film, sitting in rooms convincing people, no, why should you put your money into this group of women of color who are trying to tell a different story from what you think about when you think about a political film? It's exactly the same conversation that the participants in our film were constantly having to gain their political power, right? And so I just think there's something interesting. And Ashley, I saw you did a conversation on Facebook not so long ago where I was also watching Wrapped, because there are some delicacies about where we tread our feet in the political stance that we hold as human beings and in our documentary industry. And anyway, so I think there's something interesting to unpack about that.
Say more, Marge.
Well, I mean, No, actually, why don't you
We're trying to
Ashley,
get
tell me what you think? I
you in
mean, you know what I'm talking
trouble.
about, right, Ashley? Like, you know, we have.
No, I don't recall
You
this.
don't recall it? I mean,
Bring it back.
look, we're all
I think that this is happening every day. I don't know what you're talking
throwing
about.
Ashley under the bus. We are all making small p political statements with our work as well, right? Deeply, kind of just our presence and our defiance and our refusal to go away quietly into the night is in and of itself kind of a political action, and where we bump up against the perceived obstacles in our industry and we continue to barrel through them, we step on toes too, right? And so there is something interesting, you know, about like, I feel like if I were going to run for office, I'm way better prepared to do it, having just had the experience of trying to get this wretched film funded and seen, not the content of the film, but just the political walls that we had to like plow through just in getting it made.
Marge, can I, before everyone else jumps in, and I wanted to
Digging a hole here. Dig me out, Henry.
no.
We'd expect nothing less.
I so am in the world that you're in, Marge. Like I feel it so much about where we all are sitting and the ways in which even the very fact that you're telling stories is a political act in this moment, right? So I think there's something that Seth said, or in the film, in his film about, I can only choose to fight for us. It's my only choice. And I'm wondering, as you think about like how you are both in front of and behind the camera, what does that fight for us mean for you right now? Like, what is that in this moment? Like that's part of what you're describing. And I just wanted to, and
it's the same. My political position in the world is contained in the, you know, the experiences and the shape and the color and the history that I come from, right? And there is no difference for me in my sort of big P political stance in the world or any of the other places where I take stance in the world, right? And I think that I don't know. I think that's maybe that's the sweet spot, right? Maybe that the sweet spot and why we fight so hard for this kind of idea of authorship and who gets to tell whose stories matter and all of this sort of thing is because I'm not coming from an outside lens to examine a thing which is outside of my existence in the world, right? And that doesn't mean that I'm a woman of color running for office. Although watch this space, because Grace Lee Grace is going to fundraise for my political campaign one day and I'm going to run for office. But I don't have to be that specifically, right? But like when I show up, any place that you find me showing up, you're going to find the same me fighting for the same things. And it's always going to be for the people who, you know, aren't the ones who get to, you know, run the show, basically, right? And how can we run more of the show? And so to me, there's those things I just don't know how to, they're not two different entities, right? And I would guess that's probably the same for all of us in our work, including Anurima, the work that you do, which is not in filmmaking as well, right?
Absolutely.
Can I walk out on this limb a little bit with Marge?
It's really nice out
Yes.
here. There's a breeze out here, actually. Come and join me.
You're basically right in the middle of the soil right now. So like, no one is out on the limb. You're like, you're in the soil together. We're trying to
We're in a
about
nest.
to break it down. Yeah, no, I was just trying to synthesize everything because there's so many things you said that I resonate with, and like I'm just, you know, trying to find a language for it. But what has been really interesting to me in even the process of making my film is how it still needed to be packaged in a certain way for the mainstream doc space in order for people to align with it in a lot of ways. And in so much of what I tried to do throughout the process was like kind of defy that process, because I knew that I was 22 when I started the film. I knew I was a really young person. I didn't know that much. But I also as watching young Black people organize so amazingly in Chicago, I was like, that should not be a reason why I should not be trusted with hundreds of thousands of dollars, you know, especially when I started to even get institutional backing. We didn't get funding really for the film until 2019, and I started in 2015. So much of it was just me trying to show up authentically in spaces, knowing that that may not result in what I needed it to in order to complete the film. But I think because I was so close to my protagonist and to seeing how the movement was unfolding in Chicago, and I saw how authentic they were, I felt like if I did anything outside of that for myself, that wouldn't be authentic. That would be a disservice to the project that I was making. And it's just interesting now because I hope I'm not stepping on any toes, but I just know when the film reached a point where it started to have all of the beauty about it, and the sound design and the color and everything was like falling together so beautifully. Then the funding came, and I was like, okay, great, but like it's just like, why do we have to have this perfectly packaged language for funders and distributors when we are making projects about things that we know about? We may not know everything about it, but why is it that if someone from the white majority comes to you with the not fully formed idea, you will give them what they need? But when we're coming with something, we aren't given the same space to mess up and just figure it out as we're going along.
I'm glad you
That
jumped in,
resonates.
Ashley. I feel
That
in better
resonates
company.
a lot. Yeah. Yeah.
If it works for everyone, I'm going to turn back to the questions. There's many of them, and this sort of speaks to part of what you were asking, which is how do you tell a truthful story if you go into it with a political view or a social action agenda? And do you feel like you went into these projects with a political view or a social action agenda? Let me ask that question as part of that.
I mean, I can't keep going. Someone else go.
Yeah, Set. Go, Set.
Sorry, I was going to say, I'm kind of struggling with this question because for me, as an undocumented person, my whole existence is tied to politics. Not politics, but what's political, right? So to tell me that you are making a film, I need to make a film without a political agenda, is almost counterintuitive to my existence. Because in my community, like all these like policies around immigration reform and citizenship, whatever you have, and beyond that, around foreign policy and how those cause pull and push factors around immigration. And for me to take that out of my lived experience, through the lens of just telling a story in a way that's quote unquote truthful, and I think also the idea that if it's not political, it is truthful. I think I also don't want to kind of conflate those two ideas. It's almost like this conversation on objectivity, right? I think for me, like, in many ways, when we say like we got to be objective and neutral, in many ways it just upholds the status quo, because in many ways all of us have some type of subjectivity that we bring to our work. We look at things and see something that another person might not. And on Tuesday they were talking about the expanding, like the conversation around audio descriptions. And they were saying that filmmakers should work with their audio describers, because an audio describer sees something that they might focus on, but actually the filmmaker wants you to focus on something else, right? Mm-hmm. And in many ways, each of us have our own subjectivities. And I think my truth is valid, whether it's political, and it is political. And I think that's okay. I don't know. Sorry, I'm just rambling.
No, totally.
It's okay.
100%. Whose truth? Like, whose truth? I mean, whose truth? From whose point of view, right? I mean, we're not talking about a mathematical equation where there's a single right answer, right? And, I don't think any of us feel like our truths are adequately represented out in the media landscape. Otherwise, there's better ways to make a living, frankly, right?
Yes,
And
there are.
I mentioned this before, but so much of the work I feel that I'm doing is sort of adding a different perspective, adding a different framework to the story of of America, of politics. Yeah, I mean, it's also correcting my own understanding, my own learning, kind of unlearning. That is the pursuit that I'm interested in making these stories, making these films.
In many ways, I think that justice is to have multiple truths, is to be able to actually have the space for it. And so that is the place that we are trying to get to, right? Which is to allow for there to be many people who can stand in a way that they have dignity and a sense of justice and being able to voice. So next question is, are there effective models out there that are building the capacity of folks already in movement spaces to produce their own stories?
I'm sure there are. Seth, do you have a good answer for that? No, I was like, Seth's going to have this one. I'm sure there are. I think the thing is, like, being in movement is like not having enough capacity or resources or time to get the overwhelming job done. So in that way, movement people are very well suited to also being documentary people. But I think there is also some value to being able to have a slight step outside of being like in the thick of something. Anyway, we need more of it. I'm sure there are some people who are doing it very well, but I couldn't name them off the top of my head. I don't know if anyone else can.
I mean, I feel like someone like Seth is the perfect person to kind of lead this, because he's got his foot in this world of documentary filmmaking, also organizing, also impact producing. I think impact producing is really an area that I only have learned, have only gotten my feet wet recently, and especially with And She Could Be Next. But one of the things that we're talking about in ADOC, Asian American Documentary Network, is doing is really sort of leaning into like the impact space, because there is an affinity with documentary filmmaking and social justice. There is. I mean, in storytelling and who's telling these stories, and our stories aren't having the impact that they should. Right? Like we need to develop this muscle a little bit more. And I feel like people like Seth are the ones that are going to help us do that and like find the innovative ways to do things like that. And we need to support Seth.
Oh no.
We are
Okay.
leaders.
Yes,
We are leaders.
support everyone is what I say. All of us should have the space to thrive. I guess what the part of why I'm having also difficulty wrapping my head around the question is I feel like the question assumes that you're either in movement or you're a storyteller, and some of us are in both, and I think about like Ashley's work, and like Lan Nguyen, with ADOC, there's other people who are in the middle of spaces, right? And how can we make sure that folks, it's okay that folks, it's not frowned upon to not be either or, but to be both and. How can we build the capacity of movement folks that want to be able to tell stories? For example, in the immigrant rights, with my friends who are immigrant rights organizers, I think often we end up becoming organizers because it's almost like a method of survival. Had we not become organizers, we wouldn't have gotten any of these political victories, that allow us to improve our lives even just a little bit, right? But often we actually have other aspirations also, And what I love about And She Could Be Next is the tagline, there's an organizer in all of us, And I think in many ways, immigrant justice organizers who are directly impacted and directly impacted organizers are examples of that. But we are more than just also organizers. Many of us are artists. I think about Patrisse Cullors and the way she talks about being an organizer and a storyteller and an artist. How can we have space to really cultivate the growth of artists who come from organizing spaces? How can artists be more reflective in the fact that there is an organizer in them And also I think part of it is how can we think about BIPOC, disabled, trans, non-binary, intersex artists, not just as political storytellers, but storytellers because we're storytellers, right? I think we got to embrace the whole like gamut of questions, so that we can get to a better place in an equitable, synergistic relationship between different parties.
Can I just riff on one thing you said? Set this idea of like, why do I have to be this or that, right? Like, I think a lot of, I'm a multiple immigrant, and I've been struggling with, am I this or am I that, my whole life, right? I am both those things equally when I need to be, and together at the same time when I need to be, right? And I think that there is part, when we talk about decolonization, right? This is also part of decolonizing story, or just a frame for thinking, is that you have to be this or you have to be that. And, I think many of us who are trying to kind of build power for different voices are trying to build power from this kind of these more blurry identities in the middle of things, right? That's the part that we're trying to bring more into focus for more people. So one of the aspects is, we're trying to decolonize what that external frame is of this is this kind of story or that kind of story, as Ashley was saying. It's not this enough, it's not slick enough, it's not whatever enough. But also, let's just change the way we're thinking about which lane or box you have to be in, right? Many of us hold I think one of the reasons we follow women of color is because they hold a ton of different identities at the same time in every moment, and everything they look at and every decision they make, they're carrying multiple identities. And I think that's what our fight is for, right? Is to sort of bring forward the multiplicity of experience and expand, let us all see things from a bigger lens than the dominant lens we've only been able to look for, which is a colonial lens.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that. You're telling the stories of people who are carrying multiple intersections at a time where in this country, the country doesn't seem to be able to hold more than just one, right? And so, how do you really give a sense of the ways in which those stories can come out, and how rich and layered they are? I also was just thinking, as you were all talking about, how this idea of artist and who we are and what we bring, and I think a lot about how my brother used to say that we're all artists because we can recreate ourselves every day. And so there's a way in which this very process itself is one of engagement, of movement, is one of art, and artistry. And so how all of that is blurred in so many ways. There are a number of questions that are about impact producing, and also about the ways in which protagonists are involved in the process of making of the film, and then when the films have come out. So I'm going to start with just the first question, which is about the goals, strategies, challenges, and the depth of filmmaker involvement and protagonist involvement in the impact campaigns, and what that has been as they rolled out, and certainly have seen all of you do this in different ways. So I will turn to that first, and then I'll go to the other kinds of questions on protagonists and really thinking about their role and their voice in this.
I feel like my response really just involves protagonists, so I might jump the gun a little bit. But I mean, we're still pretty early on in our impact campaign rollout, but something that I feel has become very evident as we've been in the process is that I really want this film to be in the hands of organizers, to use as a resource to bring more people into movement space, but also like in terms of just like training and strategy and whatever ways they could utilize it in that way as well. I think like we've kind of spoken to this whole time, there's just not a lot of comprehensive media pieces told from that perspective. And so I've just seen in a lot of models in Chicago how film can be utilized in that way. Like even this summer, a collective named Let Us Breathe Collective that kind of had this occupancy on the west side of Chicago back in 2016, across from a police torture site in Chicago. They had the anniversary of the 42-day occupation, and it was beautiful. It was like thousands of people and performances and spoken word and everything else. And then we went on a march around the west side, and then at the end of it, when we got back, they played a film on the side of a building, which, you know, if you were there, you knew about, but even if you were walking by at some point in that evening, you would have known that you would have seen the film. And so for me, I think that's a really, I think that could be a really impactful way to get the film closer to the community that I want to see it, especially in the time of COVID and the pandemic, where we can't really gather in theatrical spaces. And to be honest, a lot of my target audience does not gather in theatrical spaces in we do in the documentary space. So something like that really excites me. And, I'm going to be looking to my protagonists for a lot of that support in the organizations and collectives in Chicago, because I don't want to be as hands-on with that, because I don't know the issues in the what they're working towards as well as they do. So I'm really just hoping the film can be a starting point for them to organize in the ways that they wish.
I can talk about our impact a little bit. We, our impact. We've been doing this whole thing through COVID for good times and good fun. So, I think we just have shifted. We keep pivoting, right? Like, what is the impact now? Every 3 weeks, without ever losing the centering of women of color and the power of women of color, in that, right? But because it's been hard to break through space right now, right? To capture mind share. I would say sort of early in our impact, we were really focused on the idea of women of color leading essential work, right? Leading care in our communities and the care of our communities, in this pandemic. And then, we've continued to shift, and then we got Kamala as a VP. So how are we talking about, so I think our impact sort of strategy is informed by some core tenets, but our tactics and our kind of implementation of that had to be very agile and very nimble, based on the moment we find ourselves in. Plus, of course, in case you weren't all paying attention, we are in another election cycle. And so, like Georgia, like our story gives you like super on the ground, view into 2018, Georgia elections. And then 2020's Georgia elections and the primaries rolled around, and it was even worse. It was even worse of a situation than it had been when we'd previously been there. So, so our impact work has really been informed about continually centering the voices of women of color. They should have the mic. The ones doing the work are the ones who have the mic. I mean, Grace and I show up in festival chats and dark spaces, but we try to sort of let them use their voice. And I feel like they have been involved with kind of helping co-create with us, to the extent that's been possible, given that they are literally organizing to save democracy right now. So their bandwidth for like, hey, let's talk about what impact strategies might look like is, in tension with how the hell am I going to get masks to the people in my community so they can go and vote, but we also are trying to, we're trying to really see that our impact opportunity passes beyond an election, right? Just as our civic engagement should pass beyond an election, so is the conversation that we're trying to change, the narrative shift that we're trying to create in the world. So at the moment, we're focused really on sort of impact related to voting and getting out to vote and, all of that good stuff. But the pivot is really to go back to kind of a focus on narrative shift and continuing to upload these women's voices and the voices of other women of color who are leading everywhere.
It's really strange to say this, but we are almost at time. And I know there's a number of other questions in the chat. I just wanted to honor those questions, which are a lot about how to honor participants in the films and what are the ways in which to compensate, what are the ways in which to make sure that they have agency and that they're able to benefit from the process of being in the film. And in so many ways, it's part of this larger conversation we've been having throughout, right? Which is, who are we empowering and what are we trying to empower through this process? And so I just wanted to thank all of you for your extraordinary wisdom and your extraordinary work and the ways in which you have allowed us to see and to be at home with so many of the stories and the movements and the fights of our times. And so it is the personal and the political and movement and home are all jumbled up these days in the hot mess that we're in. But I think in many ways that's going to be true and has always been true of who we are. So I in closing, I just want to thank Andrea Lust and Mara Bassani Santa Maria for ASL interpretation and the National Captioning Institute for live captioning. And to all of you who joined us today, we are grateful to have you on this Friday. And have a good weekend and get some rest because we're going to need it for the month and change ahead.
Thanks, Anirima.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Appreciate you so much.